Introducing YouTube memberships, a fun way to support the channel while getting some exclusive perks. Click the join button to become a member now and get benefits like badges next to your name on videos, behind-the-scenes photos, advantages during the live trivia game, discounts on merchandise, private one-on-one video chats, the ability to request future video topics, and exclusive 8 to 10 minute videos on the history of the NFL. And now, on with our feature presentation. For years, when you think of Monday Night Football on ABC, what do you think of? Well, besides the announcers, the grandiose theme music, the halftime highlights, and everything else under the sun that made Monday Night Football the national spectacle and pop culture phenomenon that it wound up being, you think of super late start times. Today, a Monday Night Football game will start around 8:15 or 8:20 Eastern. But back in the day, oh man, that was not the case. You wouldn't get games starting until 9 o'clock or 9:15 Eastern once ABC signed on the air and did their mini pregame show. If you were a kid, especially out on the East Coast, good luck staying up for Monday Night Football, because those games started late and ended super late as well, with long penalty-filled games or games that went into overtime ending around 1 o'clock in the morning, making it Tuesday early morning football instead of Monday Night Football. However, what you might not know is that it almost wasn't like that. Because back in 1984, while just about every single Monday night game started at 9 o'clock Eastern, as had been the case for years, there was one game that broke the mold. And that was a game between the Los Angeles Raiders and the Detroit Lions. Because in Week 15 of the 1984 season, ABC tried an experiment to try and increase ratings and see once and for all what the best time to play a Monday night game is, and whether that would be 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock. And ABC decided to test that with the Raiders-Lions game. As for the result, well, it went exactly as you'd expect, which is to say, not well, and a horribly run experiment considering the circumstances, and considering just how much was wrong with it, with extremely surface-level things. Because this is the story behind one of the craziest Monday Night Football controversies of all time, and the controversial battle between the Los Angeles Raiders and the Detroit Lions from an off-the-field perspective. Before I talk about the actual incident itself, we need some context to understand what was happening with this scheme right here in the first place, and why ABC executives were getting somewhat worried about the future of Monday Night Football to some extent. It's December 10th, 1984. It's Week 15 of the NFL season, and as we're in the penultimate week of the year, we've got an interconference battle on our hands over at the Pontiac Silverdome between the Detroit Lions and the Los Angeles Raiders. And honestly, this game didn't mean anything at the end of the day. I wish I could say otherwise, and that this game had huge implications, and it was going to be a big one under the lights. And to be fair, the final Monday night game of the year, which was the game between the Miami Dolphins and the Dallas Cowboys and was one of the greatest Monday night games ever, absolutely had that. But this one? Nothing. The Raiders entered at 10-4, having clinched not just the playoff spot, but having locked in the number 5 seed. So they were playing for nothing. And the Lions entered this one at 4-9-1. So they were eliminated from the playoffs with nothing to play for but pride. Not the most enticing of late season games. And there have definitely been better games at the end of the Monday night slate. I'll put it that way. But look, sometimes you do get a pretty good game out of a game that doesn't mean anything. Just because the game means nothing doesn't mean it can't be a fun contest to watch. That could not be said for this game though, because as you can tell from these highlights, the Raiders show their superiority and won this one convincingly, taking it by a final score of 24-3, never trailing at any point during the contest. It was an extremely sloppy affair, where 20 total penalties were committed, and the Lions committed over 100 yards of penalties. But this game was about the absolute domination of the Raiders' defense. They held the Lions to just 61 rushing yards on barely 3 yards per carry. And while 4 different quarterbacks threw a pass for Detroit, neither one of them did anything. As a team, the Lions went 16 for 39 with no touchdowns, 2 interceptions, and a passer rating of 42, just marginally better than that dreaded 39.6 number. And their quarterbacks got sacked a whopping 8 times, with John Wachowski, in the first and only start of his NFL career, taking the brunt of the punishment with 6 sacks. This was just not a good game, and this went about as everyone expected in terms of the Raiders completely overpowering the Lions. But that's not why we're here to talk about this game, because this game wasn't notable for what happened on the field. Rather, what was notable was that this was the second to last game of the season, and by this point, ABC and the NFL had noticed a rather disturbing trend when it came to their television ratings. By this point, they were going completely down the drain. Now, there were quite a few reasons for this, and while none of them were the sole reason, when you put them together, it explains quite a bit. Games were taking way too long, with the average time of the game being well over 3 hours and 10 minutes. The product was in a weird transition phase, where all of the stars from the 1970s that people grew up with were now gone, and a lot of the powerhouse teams from that era, like Dallas and Pittsburgh that people watched all the time, were no longer dominant. The rise of cable television increased the number of options that people had for entertainment, meaning that if you wanted to watch TV, the NFL wasn't competing against 2 networks anymore, but rather a couple dozen. The loss of Howard Cosell from Monday Night Football, because love him or hate him, you can't deny that he was polarizing and brought people in. People still having sour thoughts on the NFL from the strike in 1982 that wiped out half the season, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. The USFL looking like a legitimate league in the spring, meaning that football was now year-round, and people were tiring out on it. And college football, after the Supreme Court ruling in NCAA versus Board of Regents of the University of Oklahoma, rising in popularity on television now that way more games could be on TV, and it was no longer restricted in terms of how many times a team could appear on TV. In 1983, CBS pulled a 14.9 rating, NBC pulled a 10.9 rating, and ABC pulled a 17.9 rating. By the middle of 1984, CBS was at a 13, down 13% from 1983. NBC was at a 9.7, down 11% from 1983. And ABC was at a 16.1, down 10% from 1983. Many people speculated as to what exactly the problem was, especially when it came to Monday Night Football, like this game that you've been watching this whole time. Arthur Watson, the president of NBC Sports, said there is just too much football presently in the fall with the explosion of college football. There is oversaturation. The fact is, football is not just a one-season sport, but continuous throughout the year. People have found other things to do. Val Pinchbeck, the director of broadcasting for the NFL, felt similarly, saying, "There's the USFL and year-round football, and now you can watch college football from morning to almost midnight." It was a bad time for the NFL on television, especially Monday Night Football, which was definitely beginning to lose its stranglehold on the country by this point, compared to its heyday just a few years before. And one of the reasons that some speculated as to why the ratings were down the drain for that program, along with everything else mentioned, was the late start times of the program. Staying up for Monday Night Football, especially if you were a kid or you had an early day of work the next day, felt like a privilege, because the games were taking place super late at night. The East Coast wasn't happy about the start times of the program, because the games started at 9 o'clock, meaning that the game would likely not be done until sometime around 12:30 in the morning. Good luck getting kids to stay up late, and good luck getting people who aren't fans of that team to stay up, especially if the game is uncompetitive. Something was clearly broken, and it was up to ABC to fix it and to stop the skid with their declining ratings. And with that, after ABC Sports President Ruud Arledge met with NFL Commissioner Pete Rozelle, the two agreed to run an experiment. For the game that you've been watching this whole time, the battle between the Raiders and the Lions, the game would be moved up 1 hour. Instead of starting at 9 o'clock Eastern, it would start at 8 o'clock. Why did ABC want to try this? Well, Arledge always wanted to have the game get played on Mondays at 8 o'clock instead of 9 o'clock. Because he felt that even though you lose some people at the start on the West Coast coming back from work, that would be offset by the number of people on the East Coast that would stay up for the game instead of turning it off to go to bed. Now, Arledge couldn't get his way for a long time, because ABC had a fairly strong Monday entertainment slate, and convincing the bosses to start Monday Night Football at 8 o'clock, when the Monday night programming was pretty strong, was a lost cause. But by 1984, the show airing on ABC on Monday nights from 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock was this show right here, a military-themed show called Call to Glory. Even though the show premiered to high ratings after the 1984 Summer Olympics, when it was airing weekly on Monday nights, it was a disaster, to the point where not even 10 episodes in, ABC had to put out a statement saying that they were sticking behind the show 100%, which is always a good sign. It got to a point where 1 week, out of 64 programs, it ranked 54th in the Nielsen ratings. For a Monday night at 8 o'clock, that is absolutely abysmal. So ABC really didn't have anything to lose by trying this experiment with the Raiders-Lions game. The ratings for Monday Night Football were going down the drain, and the ratings for the lead-in program were completely non-existent. So screw it! Why not try something? Said ABC Sports spokesman Bob Wheeler, "It's a one-time experiment to test viewer reaction." And as Val Pinchbeck said, most of the people who live in the Eastern time zone find it difficult to stay tuned when the games run to 11:30 or 12 or 12:15. Side note, I love that Pinchbeck said that games ran to 11:30. They started at 9:05, and that was if you're lucky. What kind of football game lasts 2 hours and 25 minutes? When's the last time you watched an NFL game that was even remotely that short? And keep in mind, games were longer back in 1984 than they are today. That was delusion, but point taken. However, you might have noticed a problem with this experiment if it truly was an experiment, and that is how half-hearted and poorly designed it was. First off, a one-game sample size tells us absolutely nothing. You can't make a logical determination off of a single game, because there are so many other factors at play. What was the counter-programming? How good was the game? How important was the game? Was there any major power outage that took place in a part of the country that may have impacted the ratings? How popular were the two teams? There are so many variables that it is extremely tough to isolate the one you're looking for and truly figure out whether this was the best course of action. It's like if, hypothetically, the Jacksonville Jaguars won the Super Bowl, and the game drew 100 million viewers, and I said, "Oh, would you look at that? The Jaguars game was the highest rated game of the season and had the most viewers. Therefore, the Jaguars are the most popular team in America." Like, you see the logical fallacy there, right? You see why that logic makes no sense at all. That's the danger of a one-game sample size. And it's not like they couldn't have tried this a few times like they tried the Sunday Night Football experiment back in 1978, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. They used multiple games to come to their determination there on whether or not playing games on Sunday nights was a good idea back then. They didn't just use one measly ball game. They didn't just take a sample size of one and go with that, because that's stupid. Second off, this feels like the NFL and some ABC executives intentionally trying to sabotage themselves and say, "See, I told you so." Because when you really think about it, of all the games to test this out with, you choose this one? It's like if you're playing a game of football with your friends. Your friend draws up a play on his hand, and you say, "That play is so stupid. It's never going to work." And he says that it will, and you argue back and forth. And finally, you cave in and say, "Fine, we'll try it your way, but I'm telling you, it won't work. Then you run the route at half speed and the play fails. And you say, see, I told you, even though you weren't trying your hardest. I mean, you've got a West Coast team, so naturally, the ratings are going to be lower because the game is starting at 5 o'clock over there instead of 6 o'clock, meaning that people are still getting back from work. You've got the Detroit Lions, a team that was guaranteed to have a losing record at the time that you announced this game, and a team that entered this one at 4-9-1, playing for absolutely nothing at all. The game was blacked out in Detroit, by the way. You've got the Los Angeles Raiders, a team that was playing for nothing at all. They had 10 wins entering this game, and even if they wanted to get to 11-4, they had no shot at winning the division, seeing as the Denver Broncos and Seattle Seahawks were ahead of them at 12-3, and both the Seahawks and Broncos played each other on the final week of the season. So it was mathematically impossible for the Raiders to do anything. You've got a game with no historical impact and no rivalry, because come on, it's not like the Raiders and Lions have any major beef with each other or anything to settle. Literally, unless you were a diehard fan of football, or you really like one of these two teams, or you were just super bored and couldn't find anything on cable, there was no reason to watch this game. It's like if you're the head of a network and a TV show wants to move its time slot up from 9 o'clock to 8:30, and you're opposed, but you cave in to show the show for one night only at a special time. But the episode that's being shown is one of those clip shows that is just a bunch of flashbacks and that no one likes, and that everyone skips on the reruns. You didn't improve anything. You put something there under the worst circumstances possible. Picking an awful matchup for a sample size of 1 proves absolutely nothing in terms of your hypothesis. And there are so many flaws with this experiment that a middle school science teacher would give you a failing grade for submitting this. And to the shock of no one with a brain, because of this, the grand experiment to move the games from 9 o'clock to 8 o'clock, and the grand experiment to push the games up an hour, did not prevail. When the Nielsen ratings were calculated, the game drew a 16.1 rating, meaning that of all the households in the United States that had a TV, 16.1% of them had their TV on and had it tuned into ABC for the game. The season average was 16.4, so this Lions Raiders game we've been watching this whole time had a lower rating than the average. And the audience share for the game was 27, meaning that of all the households in the United States that were watching television on that Monday night, 27% of them tuned into ABC for the game. The season average there was 29, so this Lions Raiders game had a lower share than the average. As one writer for the Miami Herald said, the experiment was flawed from the outset. Couldn't have said it better myself. Seriously, I could not have said it better. This was unbelievably flawed, as evidenced by everything I previously mentioned. Just how flawed was this? Honestly, we have no clue if a 16.1 rating and a 27 audience share is good or bad, because even though it's below the average, the game meant nothing and was blacked out in one of the largest media markets in Detroit. When you run an experiment, any experiment that's well run and has a purpose should answer a question of what did we learn? Whether the hypothesis is right or wrong, we should at least learn something. And as it turns out, ABC learned absolutely nothing. They shuffled their entire schedule around and learned nothing. Said Jim Spence, the vice president for sports, "It's hard to make a judgment on one game. It was our decision to test the earlier start, and the NFL went along with it. We're not sure we've learned that much from the experiment." Really? I'm stunned, I tell you. I'm absolutely stunned that you learned nothing from a one-game experiment where there were a million different variables that could have impacted the ratings in a negative or a positive aspect. You're seriously trying to make a final judgment on what to do and how to set your lineup for 1985 and beyond, and you use one game, this game, to see if it's something worthwhile? That is brain dead. Just flat out brain dead. I honestly don't even know what to say. Seriously, What the heck did you think was going to happen? When the 1985 season rolled around the following year, ABC decided that the battle between these two teams behind me right here from 1984 was a one-time thing only, as every game in 1985 started at 9 o'clock Eastern. In fact, the 9 o'clock Eastern start time lasted all the way through the 2005 season, and wouldn't change until 2006, when ESPN got the rights to televise Monday Night Football, and it started around 8:20 Eastern. So that Raiders-Lions thing truly was a one-time thing. It's crazy just how late the game started for so many years. Today, Monday Night Football games start around 8 o'clock Eastern, and it's hard to imagine them ever going back to that 9 o'clock start time from 1 hour earlier. It's just way too late, and too many people in an uncompetitive game would just fall asleep. Plus, that's no way to attract the younger viewing audience. It seems like they've got a good thing going on ESPN over nearly the last 2 decades with the 8 o'clock start, and they'll stick with it. But this experiment with a Raiders-Lions game serves as a reminder of what not to do when creating an experiment. Because if you're trying to rely on a sample size of 1 to collect data that could be the difference between millions upon millions of dollars from an advertising and a rating standpoint, you're probably not going to do well, or you'll be able to validate whatever result you want without learning anything in the process of value. Because even though this game got moved up an hour, at the end of the day, both on the field and off the field, it was still a giant waste of time. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.